Well, if you've been paying attention over the last several months, and if you believe the pundits and the talking heads, the sky is falling. Regardless of how the election turns out on Tuesday, we are undone. A vote for Obama is a vote for socialism, Obamacare. You might even be voting for somebody, according to some, who is not even a U.S. citizen. And a vote for Romney is a vote for the rich, a vote to kill the educational system of our country, and we'll put money in the rich pocket and money out of your pocket. We are undone. The sky is falling. I looked in the paper again this morning and read the sense of urgency. Now, I'm not trying to say that Tuesday is not an important day. I am not trying to say that you shouldn't be informed and vote your conscience. What I want to try to say this morning is perhaps there are forces greater at work. And perhaps our country is stronger than who wins on Tuesday. We have a historical precedence for this. What I want to do with you today as we work our way into the book of Judges is that I want to show you 4 presidential elections that went really poorly and turned out okay. And then I want to take a look at the book of Judges. We are reading through the story together. Just not that you're caught up, but how many of you are still engaged in reading? Raise your hand. Over in the theater, raise your hand. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. Keep that up. Once you hear some of the stories of the judges, this little section we're in today, it is a strange set of stories that go along with it. We'll work our way through that and then try to come up with some applications of how we might engage in our culture today in a way that is informed and responsible and yet not susceptible to all of the bull that we hear. First election is in 1824. 2 men are running against each other, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Neither man carries enough of the electoral vote, and unlike today where we have these big public conventions where the party will name their candidate, back then it was done in caucus, which was basically private behind closed doors. And because no candidate, Adams or Jackson, held a clear majority in the electoral vote, it went behind closed doors. And what was called it was called the corrupt bargain of 1824, where John Quincy Adams is given the presidency supposedly over a deal that makes Henry Clay the Secretary of State. And there was tremendous outcry about Adams being the president. And for the next 4 years, he actually was under a cloud of how he had actually gotten in, although history tells us that John Quincy Adams was a pretty decent president. But in 1828, Andrew Jackson comes back, and Andrew Jackson wins handily in the 1828 election, and he's the first person born outside of the privileged few, the rich few back then. He's the first commoner to be elected as president. And in this situation, it was the first time that nationally we had kind of organized and stood against the corruption of the John Quincy Adams administration. And Andrew Jackson, we finally got the man we wanted, and he carried the popular vote as he did in 1824, but now he had enough electoral votes to be in. History will tell you that Andrew Jackson was a terrible president, but we got who we wanted. We survived it. We came to 1860, and there's this little issue called slavery going on. The national government felt like it needed to make a stance, and so it was done around a fairly new party, the Republican Party. It was new at that time, and they picked an unknown candidate who was even unpopular in his own home state, named Abraham Lincoln. The election process was very close. It was very heated. Abraham Lincoln was chosen as our president, and immediately, before they could even swear him in and have him inaugurated, the 11 states from the Union seceded out, and that began 4 bloody, terrible years of civil war. We didn't get who we wanted. We got Abe Lincoln, who historians say is probably the finest president we've ever had. Fast forward to the year 2000. Maybe some of you remember that mess. 2 men were running against each other, George W. Bush and Al Gore. And one man carried the popular vote, Al Gore, by over 500,000 votes. But he did not carry the electoral vote because of a very close thing that happened down in a state called Florida. They had this little issue called Chads hanging up in the votes. And so we had, for the first time ever in the history of our nation, a candidate sue the national government for a recount in Florida. The Supreme Court stepped in for also the first time ever and declared George W. Bush our president amidst an incredible outroar. Now, regardless of how you feel about those next 8 years, I can't imagine not having George W. Bush as our president during 9/11 and the leadership he exercised in that time. All that to say that possibly there are greater forces at work than the editorial section of the San Jose Mercury would have you believe. Perhaps, regardless of who gets elected, and I think it's important who gets elected, don't misunderstand me, but perhaps God is still God, and Obama and Romney are certainly not. Now, nothing shows us this any clearer than the book of Judges. This crazy little book of Judges, which serves as a hinge about what's going on historically. Let me give you some context for it. Joshua's now dead. They've come into the promised land. Remember in the story, they had moved into Egypt. They had been turned into slaves. They had been delivered out with Moses, and then Joshua took over. They came into the promised land. They didn't do all of that they were supposed to do, but they've conquered a big chunk of it. They've divided the land up, and then they basically operate as separate little city-states and nations that are by tribe, and there's not a unified Israel in all of the book of Judges. When you read the book of Judges, you need to understand that they've got these leaders, but don't think of a modern day judge like a civil judge or a Supreme Court judge. It would be really more, although they did sometimes rule on issues of civil law, mostly what the judges did is they were military leaders with charisma that rallied a bunch of people to fight. And you go to this book of Judges now, and it's kind of a hinge between Joshua and them taking the land and the appointment of kings that we'll be at in a couple of weeks when we are introduced to Saul and then David and Solomon, his son, and the nation as it gets unified. It's not unified now. In fact, the book of Judges covers 300 years of different leaders that sometimes overlap. They never do rally the whole nation. There's maybe someone down south does one thing and another judge up north is doing another, and their rules may even, when they're doing it, may even overlap in years. And all the way through the book, there's this strange cycle that gets repeated over and over and over again, where the Israelites are suppressed and under oppression from a nation, and they call out to God, and God hears their prayer and raises up a judge and delivers them from the oppression. And then they begin to do what they shouldn't have done, and they turn from God, and then God allows them to be oppressed again, and they humble themselves, and they call out to God, and God raises up a judge, and then that judge delivers them, and then they turn from God again, and they get oppressed again over and over and over. 6 times in the book of Judges, you see this cycle over and over again. And these judges just begin to kind of rise up and lead them. And there's some themes that go throughout the whole book. It's a theme of lawlessness. They don't follow the laws that Moses had given the people that they said that they would follow. They are blind to the workings of God and the things that God asks of them. And they live completely immoral laws. In fact, over and over in the book of Judges, there's this phrase, people did what was right in their own eyes. They just determined what they would do, and they just kept doing it over and over, and it got them in trouble over and over and over again. Now, as you do that then, as you look at this, there's lots of judges we could have picked out to kind of look at. I guess I would say my 4 favorite judges. So maybe you got better judges and different favorites. That's okay. But I'm the one talking, so we get to do mine. And I want to share these stories with you as an encouragement to you that you can't believe some of these things are actually in the Bible. When you read the stories of these guys and some of the things that it learns in terms of how we should, our attitude in terms of how we can trust God in our own national affairs is pretty amazing. The first judge I want to introduce to you is Ehud. Ehud shows up in Judges chapter 3. And Ehud is this guy who has a problem physically. He's different than everybody else, or most people physically. And you know what it is? He's left-handed. Any left-handers in the room? A lot in the back. I don't know what's going on back there, but you people are really unique and strange and wonderful. I know that because I live with the left-hander. We're told that about 10 to 12% of our population is left-handed. All kinds of things don't work for them. Scissors and things don't work right for them because they're left-handed. Ehud's left-handed. Now, back in the day when soldiers were being trained, no soldiers fought left-handed. It was for uniformity, and when you lined up beside one another, you know this, left-handers, because whenever you sit down to eat, you're always against my right arm. And they would do the same thing in soldiering. They would make everybody fight with their right hand. So Ehud has an advantage. And let me tell you the story, what happens. There's an evil king, and Ehud is supposed to go and kill this king. He makes himself a knife. This knife does not have the hilt, the cross blade right there, between the cross thing between the handle. And so he straps the blade to his right leg, being left-handed, so he could reach down and grab it and have it like that, I guess. And so it actually was so common that no one would strap their blade to that leg that when the soldiers searched him, they only searched his left leg, because that's the only place that people that carried swords would carry them. So Ehud's able to sneak in to the king, and he's got his blade strapped to his leg, and he chickens out. He heads home. And on his way home, he sees the rocks that Joshua built by the river and the monument that God is great. And he feels such guilt that he turns around, goes back to this king. And this king is one of the fattest dudes in the whole Bible. He's so fat that when Ehud stabs him, he stabs him with this blade without a hilt. And his hand follows the blade all the way into his belly. And that when he pulls the blade out, he leaves the blade in him. That's just gross. I don't care who you are. Now watch what happens. Ehud then sneaks out, and the king falls over, and the scriptures say literally his bowels emptied. Watch this. Watch this. It just gets better. He's got guards outside of the door guarding him, and Ehud's kind of gone out. And these guards are start to worry about him. But apparently the smell was so bad that they assume he's using the bathroom. I'm not making this up. It's in the Bible. Apparently he had a history of being so smelly when he went to the bathroom that the guards could smell it on the other side of the door. They finally go in after hours worried about him sitting on the pot so long, and they come in to find him. He's dead by then. Ehud has escaped, and the nation of Israel is delivered. Come on now, that's just weird. The next judge is, if Ehud fights with the wrong hand, the next judge, Deborah, is an outstanding judge, one of the finest judges listed in the book of Judges, but Deborah's the wrong sex. This is a patriarchal society. This is a culture that is led by men. Women don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to property. They're not taught how to drive chariots. No driver's license there. And yet Deborah, in a courageous, incredible integrity, leads the nation of Israel into these battles and is victorious. Then there's Gideon. Gideon's from the wrong tribe. He's from the weakest clan of all of the tribes of Israel. And he's called to lead these folks. He's a farm boy. And yet God uses him to rally this great army. One of the largest armies ever listed in the book of Judges is from this little Gideon dude. And then God says, your army's too big. Tell the people that if they're afraid to fight, they can leave. Well, he had almost 30,000 people there. Almost all of them left. And he goes through this thing saying, it's still too many, it's still too many, it's still too many. Let's do this. Lead them over to the river, and if they cup the water in their hands and raise it up to their mouth and drink it that way, tell them they can go. But if they get water in their hands and lap it with their tongue, they get to stay. I don't know anybody who drinks water that way. Listen, if you're here today and that's how you drink water from the river, would you come see me after the service? I'd like to meet you. Nobody drinks water like that. Weirdly enough, 300 people in Israel out of 30,000. They're a weird group. And God uses that little tiny army so that God gets the glory instead of the strength of an army. Well, Ehud's fights with the wrong hand, and Deborah's the wrong sex, and Gideon's the wrong tribe. And Samson, he's just wrong. I mean, he's rash. He's arrogant. He's gullible. He's lustful. The only thing going for him is that he's strong, and only part of the time. Now, I don't know about you, but I see the kind of people that God uses to lead in the scriptures and how he uses people to lead today. And here's the truth. God gets done what he gets done in spite of us, not because of us. In spite of us. Just met with a man this past week. He was singing your praise. All the things that he's heard about Westgate and what the community has accomplished. And I just told him over and over again, it's amazing in spite of us. God gets done what he wants to get done. Perhaps, men and women, he can accomplish what he wants done on Wednesday, regardless of who wins on Tuesday. Now, there's something else I want to say while we look at these judges with the wrong fighting hand and the wrong sex and the wrong physical attributes and the wrong tribes and just wrong. There are some of you that have embraced a lie. And that lie is that God can't use you. And you have stepped back and you have decided to keep away from kind of the fray. I mean, you come and you be named among us, but you're mostly just kind of consuming what life has to offer, refusing to step in and stand up for what you believe. Thinking that you have nothing valuable to say, that you can't contribute. Well, who am I? I don't have any of those physical tools to be able to do that kind of a thing. I can't talk out loud like Steve does, or who am I? I'm the wrong sex. Nobody ever listens to me. I don't ever get a hearing with people. I mean, who am I? I can't even stay according to my own convictions. I sin all the time, and if you looked at my life, you would see just nothing but a series of failures, and I confess and I fail, and I confess and I fail. Who am I to ever say anything? Who am I that God might use me? And I would just tell you that you're just being perfect company with the rest of us. The scriptures are full of God getting done what he's going to get done in spite of us. There was a time in my life that I was so complaining about what was going on with me physically. I'm short. I'm bald. I'm gray. I'm getting shorter, it seems, balder for sure, and grayer too. I don't like you dudes that are tall with hair. But it's time we stop embracing the lies that say we don't have anything to offer, that God could not use someone like me. Because the book of Judges screams out loud. He specializes in using people that don't have their life together, which gives me great comfort every weekend. Now, in light of all of the things that we learn in the book of Judges, how do we navigate this political climate today? A political climate that really is a lot more about character assassination than the issues that are involved. How do we navigate what it looks like to speak into that and to be informed and to somehow operate with a different compass than the rest of our culture seems to be operating with? I named this section of our message, Wading Through the Bull, Fighting the Anger, and Being Like Jesus. Because I think that's the ticket. I think the ticket really is to figure out how Christ interacted with his culture and try to emulate and copy that. That's what we're trying to do here, is call one another to the hard task of being a person of truth and grace like Jesus Christ. But here's the deal. When I talk to people, I think most people think Jesus is kind of like an old Middle Eastern Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Would you be mine? Well, would you? Now, I know there's a Mr. Rogers lover in the crowd. Sorry. Nothing against him. But let me clearly state, him and Jesus have very little in common, especially the cashmere sweater. Let me show you a picture of what Christ was like when he interacted with the culture and the values that he kind of championed. And let's see if we can try to do that. It comes from Luke chapter 14. And I believe before Luke chapter 14 happened, Jesus was back, with his disciples, and he was with them, and he's saying, hey, I'm going to go have dinner with those religious leaders. And they said, oh, man, are you sure? And he said, yeah, I'm going to go there, and I'm going to pick a fight. Pray for me. Pray for me. I'm going to go pick a fight there. I want to show you that in this little dinner that he has, he picks 4 fights with them. Nothing like Mr. Rogers. Here's how it starts out in verse 1 of chapter 14 in Luke. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner in the home of a leader of the Pharisees. And the people were watching him closely. And there was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen. Bible scholars believe he had edema or dropsy. It's a body that retains fluid just under the skin level, and in the body cavities you fill up, and it fills up, and it deforms. It's very visible. It's very painful. You're very deformed looking and bloated, big bloated. And back then there was no cure. You would die either of liver failure or heart failure with this. The only reason he's there is that he's a plant for Jesus. There's no way ever that this guy would be invited, someone like that, to the religious leader's home. They felt like if they were sick, then that meant that they must be under the judgment of God, and they would not ever have anything to do with them. And so they've brought him in just to see how Jesus will react to him. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in religious law, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? And when they refused to answer, Jesus does something that's extraordinary. He touched the sick man. I mean, he literally put his fingers, and you know how in edema, in this disease, when you put your hand on there, you can leave a print when you pull it away. The print, it just sinks into their skin. And he touches this man, and with compassion, heals him and sends him away. When I hear this, when I read this, I think it was kind of like Fat Albert, the movie Fat Albert with Eddie Murphy. And he's like really fat, and then all of a sudden he's really skinny. Am I the only one that stays up late and watches these stupid movies? Have you seen this movie? Anyway, this happens in real life. Jesus does this. He says, he touches him and heals, and the guy just, I don't know if he left a puddle of water or anything, but he goes out healed, and they can tell that he's healed. And then Jesus says, you took this dude and you brought him here to advance your political and religious agendas. You used him as a piece of flesh. And Jesus declares he has infinite worth before the eyes of God. Infinite. He's as valuable as every person on the planet. And these distinctions that you make because you see yourself as a religious leader, God does not view people that way. Then he goes on, as if that's not enough, he decides, you know what, since I'm on the roll here, he says, when you came in, verse 7, when you came in, all you dudes picked the best seats, the places of honor. Instead, when you come in, you should take some of the worst seats. You should humble yourselves in recognition before the God you serve, that you are nothing but his instrument. And this projection, he says, you want to know who's important? He just picks a fight about how people want to be important. They want to be somebody. They want to be recognized as a celebrity. And he says, don't view life that way. Humble yourselves. Now, today, in today's culture, we hear that and go, yeah, humble yourselves. Humility is a good thing. Here's what you got to get. In the Greco-Roman world, up until Jesus, humility is never seen as a virtue. Ever. Not any. And then once Jesus begins to teach about humility and humbling yourself before God, it is a huge virtue from then on, championed by his people. Then he goes on to say, now that we're here, he turns to the host. He's already slammed everybody in the room. So he turns to the host and he says, you know, when you invited people here, you basically invited your buddies. You invited people who will invite you back. In other words, you come to lunch to my house today and I'll come eat at your house tomorrow. He says, don't do that. When you throw a feast, invite, and this is what Jesus says, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Now, you could not have picked 4 categories less likely to get invited by religious people in the first century in Palestine. They thought God was against those people. And Jesus, with this giant rebuke, declares this is who should be invited. God's heart is for all of the people. And then, you ever been at a party or something and it got really negative? And you try to say something to try to change the subject and pick up the beat a little bit? No? Yes. Okay, yeah, of course you have. Well, that's what happens in this thing. I mean, Jesus is going through these things and it's just gotten really uncomfortable. And everybody's going, who invited this dude? And so when he starts talking about the feast, here's what one guy says in verse 15. Hearing this, a man sitting at the table with Jesus exclaimed, what a blessing it will be to attend the banquet in the kingdom of God. I mean, it's just a typical churchy answer. What a blessing it will be to be at the banquet. Since you said banquet, Jesus, won't it be good? Now let's go get something to eat. And Jesus now says, well, since you brought the banquet up, let me pick another fight. I've seen the list. Let me tell you who's in the banquet. And it ain't the religious leaders. Who is it? The poor, the cripple, the blind, and the lame, and the humble. Since you brought it up, and I've been there. Let me tell you who's in. And it's like Jesus says, open wide your views. God's heart is extended to all people. Listen, men and women, we're going to have to spend a lot of time in heaven apologizing to brothers and sisters of a different political persuasion for the things that we said this past month. That's right. Democrats are going to get in. That's right. Republicans are going to get in. That's right. Sinners are going to get in by God's grace. And if they don't get in, we ain't in. Broaden out what the heart of God is for this world. And interact and speak truth. Step into the mess. But do it like Jesus does, with grace and truth. I got to tell you, I got to be honest with you. If you want me to be Mr. Rogers, I am not involved. I have no interest in being that. Amen, men? Somebody may like Mr. Rogers, you on the front row, but most of men don't. We want to speak about our political convictions and our religious convictions the way we speak about our athletic affiliations and our job. Gals, you do too. You don't want to mealy mouth all around and act like you don't have an opinion. Yeah, whatever. I'm so sick of whatever. I think we ought to strike that word from our language. Yeah, whatever. Now, I am not saying that you shouldn't vote. I am not saying you shouldn't be involved. I'm not saying you shouldn't get informed and vote your conscience. Of course I am. We'll see as we look at the kings later on. It's vastly important who leads us. It is. It makes a difference. But I'm saying that the challenge for us as believers is to somehow escape all the anger. Why are we so mad? Why are the people that are affiliated with me and my Christian faith always seem so angry on the TV? Could it be that we really don't believe God can get done what he says he will get done in spite of us? We have a great position of strength. We have a God who loves the world more than we can ever imagine and will get done what he wants to get done. And we can rest in that. But we also should humble ourselves in that and recognize what he can do for us. It says in 2 Chronicles, then if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and restore their land. If there is ever a time when we need more of Christ and less of the rhetoric, more of grace and truth and less of all of the anger, it is now. Men and women, we can do this. We can change. We can change the way our world interacts. One at a time, collectively together, humbling ourselves, praying and seeking God's face. And he says, I will hear you and I will hear your land. See, here's the truth. All those consequences of what was going on in the book of Judges and the cycles there of lawlessness, of blindness and refusal to acknowledge God, and of this immorality of doing whatever you think is right, that sounds pretty familiar to me. Doesn't it? Maybe 3,000 years, it hasn't changed quite that much. And I think God is waiting for a group of people that will humble themselves and seek his face so that he can jump into the fray in powerful, loving, and magnificent ways. Let's pray that he'll do just that. God, forgive us. Forgive us for believing the lies that you can't use people like us. Forgive us for leaving the fight to someone else. Forgive us for our apathy. Forgive us for our anger. Forgive us for our sin. May we be a people that are characterized by who Jesus is, his courage, his clarity, his heart for all people. God, would you create that in us as a community? Would you create that in me? And we ask, God, with all our hearts, that your will would be accomplished among us, in this church, in our city, and in our nation. That your will would be accomplished as if it were in heaven. And that many, many millions of people will come to know you because of the freedom of your Spirit and the movement of it as we model Christ to our neighbors. Thank you for the privilege of living in this country. We do pray, God, for the elections. We pray for both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, that they would have dreams at night of your grace and love, and they would embrace you with their whole heart, surrender their lives, and serve you. May that be true of each of us as well. In Jesus' name.